Later tonight, we're going to hear from Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as he addresses the country as Trump's vice presidential pick. Today, in his first campaign appearance in that position, Vance called his running mate Donald Trump a real leader and a great president. We're going to hear much more of that later tonight, but we do not expect to hear any more of this kind of stuff tonight. Critical comments Vance made about Trump when he ran for president the first time in 2016. Here's a sampling. I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical a-hole like Nixon, who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that Trump is America's Hitler. The guy J.D. Vance wrote that text to, his old Yale Law School roommate and current Georgia State Senator Josh McLaurin, joins us now. State Senator McLaurin, thanks for spending a little time with us this evening. The first thing I got to ask you is, in your time in the Ivy Leagues with J.D. Vance, did you get any inkling of the deep disgust he apparently has for Ivy League intellectuals who he now believes are part of a regime that has developed an economic platform that is distinctly at odds with what is good for, quote unquote, real America? Did you sense that kind of, I'll call it populism, when you were rooming with him in the Ivy Leagues?
Hi, Alex and Chris. Great to join you. I mean, in a word, yes, but it was limited, right? I mean, so much of this MAGA stuff is performance, right? You have to choose to really lay it on thick, but it may come from, some legitimate gripes or anger that some voters have. I mean, there's anger on both sides, but it's a choice to turn that into contempt. And I think that that's what JD has been doing ever since getting into politics and why he's such an effective communicator and amplifier for the MAGA movement. But at the time in 2010, I really liked him at first. I think a lot of people did too. He's charismatic one-on-one, he's intelligent, and he had thoughtful things to say about conservative positions. Like, he didn't just echo all of the unlimited gun rights talking points, for example. He once told me he thought the Second Amendment was a paradox because it's law, but it's also, preserving the right of people maybe to overthrow their government, which is inconsistent with law and order. So, I mean, he was thoughtful about things like that, but, he was skeptical of the law school environment. That's one of the reasons he and I didn't get along so well as the years went by, or really the months. I mean, we figured it out quickly, but then into the foreseeable future is that he had a very caustic and sarcastic sense of humor about the law school and some of the people there. And I mean, I ran the comedy show at law school, so I was trying to have maybe a good time. So I think what we're seeing now is that anger that he had, maybe from childhood, who knows, it kind of doesn't matter. He is now taking that anger and saying he wants to impose that bad feeling, that contempt on the whole country because of his great distrust for and the caricature that he's made out of media, the left, whatever his political opponents might be.
You received that text where he calls Trump potentially America's Hitler. He's now the running mate to a man he called potentially America's Hitler. Does that, I mean, I understand the anger and the contempt and the grievous rage, but to cede your values, it sounds like, if you're someone who's skeptical of the Second Amendment, standing in line with Trump shoulder to shoulder, I mean, does that make sense? Does that comport with the person you once knew? It's a staggering 180.
I mean, we all know it doesn't make sense, right? So then we're all like grasping to explain it. And you can imagine I've had a lot of conversations with old friends and new about this moment. And the thing that keeps coming up is when you think that your opponent is evil or you think your opponent is worthy of contempt, then your principles don't really matter anymore. If the bigger you make your enemy into, the more cartoonish your enemy is, whatever principles or thoughtfulness you might have had, you can just throw those by the wayside because it's justified by that contempt. And so I think what we've seen with him is he had a gut reaction like so many of us did to Trump. He said, this guy's clearly like narcissistic. He's a fraud. I mean, he was saying that Trump was a fraud all the way until 2021. There's recently unearthed audio to that effect. So it's not like he doesn't get it. He was very insightful. I mean, the text he sent me said that Trump was the fruit of collective neglect by the Republican Party, who was ignoring the working class, and that he was a demagogue who was exploiting the failures of his party. That is sophisticated analysis that still holds true. I think that's what makes him more than just an ordinary flip-flopper, right? Like, plenty of Republican elected officials were against Trump before they were for Trump. And I think that's why the campaign is trying to treat it like old news. But JD's different, and I think more dangerous, because rather than just be an empty suit who's sort of parroting MAGA talking points, I think that he has let his anger really take over his life and make him convinced that Trump is the right choice for America. I don't think he's going home and having a whiskey and putting his feet up and saying, oh man, that Trump guy's crazy, but I have to defend him on TV. I think he's at this point so angry, so motivated by that spirit of revenge that Trump has publicly espoused, that he's the perfect running mate for Trump, which I've said recently, and also that he's really really amplifying the MAGA moment and doubling down instead of being a more moderate pick.
Yeah, on that last point, I spent the last few days doing a lot of reading of J.D. Vance interviews with him, things that he's written, some of the profiles of him, a lot of his social media production. And my thesis from afar is that he has radicalized himself, that whatever began as opportunism, a sort of plant growing towards the light, as it were, this is obviously the path to power and status in the Republican Party. That's obviously inseparable from this. But that he's a true believer in all this, in the same way that, like, we've watched Elon Musk basically self-radicalize in real time online. We've watched a bunch of these people do this, and that I'm just curious what you think of that as a theory, because I think a lot of it's about the opportunism that we've been hearing. But to me, I see someone who is fully committed to this agenda. When he says to a Vanity Fair reporter, the president should fire every mid-level bureaucrat and then defy the Supreme Court when they strike it down, I don't think that's posturing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you can think of it in addition to being opportunism for his political advancement, it's also opportunism to be a jerk, right? I mean, that's why I tweeted recently, I think that this is a triumph for angry jerks everywhere. I really mean that, because even if JD is just mostly angry on TV, he is creating the same permission structure that Trump has spent years creating, which is ordinary Americans can show contempt towards one another and nothing will happen to you, right? It's like what you hear about in schools, bullying increasing, this moment being deleterious for the whole country's culture. So I think that JD he really either underestimates or doesn't care the effect of this type of contempt spilling over into everyday life and further deteriorating our political culture. I agree with you that I think that he has drunk the Kool-Aid wholesale, because that's the way to motivate his sincerity when he brings that kind of anger to his messaging.
It's one way to motivate sincerity, just sheer contempt and rage. Georgia State Senator Joshua McLaurin, thanks for really providing some very helpful analysis and perspective. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to be live tweeting in frustration later on our caucus Twitter account, GA Senate Dems, in case you guys want to follow along. But it's really been an honor to join you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat of Arizona, joins us now. Senator Kelly, I just want to first get your reaction as you are in the Senate, and we are hearing some reports from ABC News, to some degree confirmed by our sources with NBC News, that Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, had a one-on-one conversation with President Biden in Delaware on Saturday, where it sounds like, took the concerns of his caucus to the president and suggested he needed to step down. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I just heard that today, and we've had meetings with Senator Schumer over the last couple of weeks, talking about this issue. But I think the reality of the situation is that President Biden and Kamala Harris are our nominees. Millions of Americans voted for them across the country, and 50 states and territories. And we have an election in 110 days. And we've got to be focused on that. We've got to make sure that we work as hard as possible, not make any mistakes here. And if we do that, I'm confident that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can be reelected.
Do you think that's the view of your fellow Democrats in the Senate as well?
Well, I'm not going to get into, our internal discussions, and I'm not going to speak, for my colleagues. I will say that there are differing views.
Let me ask you this, Senator. We were just discussing, of course, the assassination attempt, which just happened a few days ago in Butler, Pennsylvania. Obviously, your wife, Gabby Giffords, was shot and grievously wounded when serving as a United States congressperson. You know firsthand the effects of both gun violence and political violence, what it does, even just at the human level. I am curious to hear how you've reacted to this news, how it landed in your household when it's so close.
Well, certainly for me, it brought back, memories from, those days, the day that Gabby was shot. As you said, she was serving in Congress. She was meeting with her constituents. She was a member of Congress. At the time, I was an astronaut. I'd flown a few space shuttle missions. I flew 39 missions in combat. But as it would turn out, my wife, Gabby Giffords, was the person who had the dangerous job. And it's sad to think that this continues. I mean, that was 13 years ago, and today we still have this kind of political violence. I really feel for the president, former president, and his family, certainly for the family members of the firefighter that was killed that day. There is no place in our society for this kind of violence.
Do you Senator, sorry, it's Alex Wagner again. Do you have a sort of an assessment of how the Republican Party has grappled with the attempted assassination of its ticket leader? Have you gotten anything, I think, as someone who's experienced it yourself and has feelings about it and has processed it, what do you make of how the GOP is grappling with it on whole?
Well, I mean, having experienced this myself, I know it's got to be shocking for them. I mean, to think that this could happen, and I'm thankful that the shooter was not successful. The former president was extremely lucky here and was only slightly injured. But we have an election coming up, and we've got to tone down the rhetoric. I was on Capitol Hill on January 6th. And when the former president, through political speech, sent a mob up there to interfere with the peaceful transition of power. And, that shouldn't be something that's tolerated in our society. And I'm concerned if this continues that we could have additional people injured or killed. So I think it's on all of us to try to tone down the rhetoric, to focus on the election, which is a very patriotic thing that happens every 2 or 4 years in our country. And we've got to resolve our differences at the ballot box. One thing that really concerns me, Alex, is that with the selection of J.D. Vance, you have somebody that is only in that position as the vice presidential candidate because of his loyalty to Donald Trump, and that he would do what Mike Pence refused to do, which is to change the outcome of the election. And then you add on top of that his issues that he has with women's reproductive rights, which I'd be happy to get into in more detail. I'm really concerned that J.D. Vance could be a heartbeat away from the presidency.
Senator, I'm glad you brought up J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance was one of 2 Senate candidates in the last cycle that were heavily backed by right-wing billionaire Peter Thiel. There's kind of a group of people, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, some others, this kind of very right-wing tech billionaires.
Yeah, Chris, the other one was my opponent.
That's exactly
Blake
what I was going to ask you. You learned something because you got millions of dollars dropped on your head on behalf of Blake Masters, who you defeated. And
right,
I'm curious what you learned from that race.
Well, they're very similar. I mean, I know these guys. I mean, J.D. Vance wants a total abortion ban. Total abortion ban. And when asked about exceptions for rape and incest, what did he say? He said 2 wrongs don't make a right. When is it wrong for a woman who has been raped to want to terminate a pregnancy? And he said that these were just inconveniences, that the fact that a woman could be pregnant after being raped. An inconvenience is when you get stuck in traffic on your way home from work. I have 2 daughters. I have a granddaughter. I'm really concerned about J.D. Vance being a heartbeat away from the presidency, and also just as vice president, being involved in decision-making that can affect my kids. This guy voted against protections for birth control and IVF. And, he's also, when he talks about Social Security and Medicare, talks about how this is a roadblock. Those programs are lifelines for millions of seniors across our country.
Senator, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you envision in terms of MAGA 2.0 if J.D. Vance is the vice president. He comes from, or he's rooted in a form of conservatism that almost makes MAGA look moderate in some ways.
Well, I think with anything, 2.0 is usually worse than 1.0. So, I would expect this thing to eventually will go off the rails. But I think what the American people need to recognize is, that their freedoms and their rights are at stake here in this election on November 5th. We've got to get our voters out, showing up to make sure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are reelected. I am really concerned about our future with 4 more years of Donald Trump in the White House, and then what could come after that with possibly with J.D. Vance.
Senator Mark Kelly, thank you for making the time tonight. Really, really appreciate it.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.